On Air, Deep Dive Podcast Brazil.
All right, so we're going to take a deep dive today into the current situation in Brazil under President Lula. We've got an interesting mix of sources here, some notes on potential U.S. influence, a few articles on Brazil's economy and the whole political climate there, even a podcast focusing on some of the challenges they're facing. So ready to unpack all this.
Absolutely. It's a very complex picture, but I think the crucial thing is to really understand how all these pieces fit together. You know, the economy, politics, international relations, they're all intertwined.
Yeah, it's like a tangled web. And I think one of the biggest threads in that web has got to be Brazil's debt. It's massive. A staggering 8 trillion reais, which is something like 75% of their entire GDP. So let's just put that in perspective. It's as if for every $100 Brazil earns, 75 goes straight to paying off debt. Ouch.
Yeah, that's a really significant burden for any economy. And it really limits a government's ability to invest in, critical areas, healthcare, education, infrastructure, all of which ultimately impacts the quality of life for everyday Brazilians.
And we're seeing those impacts play out in our sources. One mentions rising fuel and grocery prices, which, really hits people where it hurts, right in their wallets. It's a tough situation when the cost of living just keeps climbing, while the government's grappling with this mountain of debt.
It definitely raises questions about the government's priorities, Like, for instance, one source mentions Lula's government purchasing a new presidential plane optically. It's a really tough sell when everyday Brazilians are struggling.
Yeah, it feels like a disconnect, for sure. And then we have this other major development, Lula's appointment of a socialist judge to the Supreme Federal Court, the STF, which is Brazil's highest court.
Yeah.
And this has stirred up quite a bit of controversy.
Yeah, it's definitely fueled a lot of concerns about judicial impartiality and potential overreach. The STF plays a really crucial role in upholding the Constitution and ensuring a fair judicial system. So appointing a judge with such clear ideological leanings really raises questions about potential bias in rulings and maybe even a shift towards greater government control over the judiciary.
Some of our sources directly address that concern. One explicitly calls this appointment a move towards greater government control, suggesting that Lula's administration might be aiming to consolidate power and potentially weaken the checks and balances that are essential for a healthy democracy.
That's one interpretation. But another source we have, it emphasizes concerns about institutional neutrality, suggesting this appointment could undermine judicial independence, even if it's not necessarily a deliberate power grab.
So we have these internal pressures, a struggling economy, concerns about political maneuvering, but there are also significant external factors at play here. Let's shift gears a bit and look at Lula's stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict, which has definitely raised eyebrows internationally.
Yeah, his approach has certainly differed from many global allies. While condemning the violence. His criticism of Israel's response to those October 7th attacks has drawn some pretty sharp rebukes from countries like the U.S. and Israel. What's really interesting, though, is how Hamas leadership has actually praised Lula for his stance.
Yeah, and that's a pretty stark contrast to the widespread condemnation Hamas is facing globally. It makes you wonder about the potential international consequences for Brazil. Could this damage relationships with key allies? Could this even shift Brazil's whole foreign policy direction?
It's definitely a possibility. And then there's the potential impact of the U.S. political landscape to consider. Our notes mention the potential return of Donald Trump to the presidency, which could significantly impact Brazil's foreign policy as well.
Yeah, that's a real wild card. Trump's anticipated focus on countering, socialist and authoritarian influences in Latin America could clash pretty directly with Lula's government, especially considering their ideological differences on things like the role of government in the economy, social issues.
Absolutely. Their contrasting styles and agendas could definitely lead to some friction and impact cooperation on things like trade, security, other key areas. It's almost like Brazil's caught in this geopolitical tug of war. You've got the U.S. on one side and countries with very different ideological views on the other.
It's a delicate balancing act for Brazil, for sure. But let's bring it back to the situation within Brazil itself for a minute. One of our sources, a podcast actually, paints a pretty bleak picture of life under Lula. Soaring prices, increased taxes, a growing sense of insecurity.
Yeah, it's a perspective worth considering for sure. This podcast really highlights the struggles of everyday Brazilians. They argue that, the economic hardship is very real and that government policies like these increased taxes are really adding to the burden on citizens. They even allege that an STF minister imprisoned innocent citizens. without legal justification.
Wow, that's a heavy accusation, if true. It points to a concerning disregard for due process and raises serious questions about the state of democratic norms in Brazil. They also mention government censorship and journalists leaving Brazil out of fear of arrest.
Those are troubling signs. A free and independent press is absolutely crucial for a functioning democracy. Silencing critical voices, stifling dissent, those are hallmarks of authoritarian regimes.
It seems like we're seeing a pattern emerge here, with potential overreach from the judiciary, controversial political appointments, and allegations of government censorship. It paints a concerning picture, and I'm definitely curious to dig deeper into these issues.
Yeah, let's delve into those next. We need to unpack the potential consequences of these developments and really try to understand what they mean for the future of Brazil. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive, episode 2024-1130. Part 2 of 3. And what's particularly concerning, I think, is how these individual issues, the economy, the politics, the allegations of overreach, they start to kind of form this larger, more troubling narrative.
Yeah, like a perfect storm brewing. And then you layer on that unpredictable element of international relations, potential friction with the U.S., alignment with controversial figures like Hamas. It really makes you wonder what's next for Brazil.
Exactly. It's this complex equation with so many unknowns, but one thing is clear, the stakes are high, not just for Brazil, but potentially for the region, and even the global balance of power.
This podcast episode we've been referencing, they really drive that point home. They lay out a case that suggests Brazil, under Lula, is moving in a very dangerous direction. They specifically mention rising crime rates, and this feeling that the rule of law is eroding.
Right, and that aligns with some of the other concerns we've discussed. I mean, if the government is seen as overreaching its authority, silencing critics, potentially undermining judicial independence, it just erodes public trust, creates this climate of fear and uncertainty.
And when people feel insecure, like their basic rights aren't protected, it has this ripple effect. Throughout society, it can impact everything, from economic investment to social cohesion.
Absolutely. It creates a sense of instability that's really hard to reverse.
In this podcast episode we've been talking about, they don't pull any punches. They call out specific incidents of alleged government corruption and misuse of power.
It's tough to hear, but it's important.
For example, they highlight the case of a journalist who was imprisoned and later released in a wheelchair, claiming it was a direct result of his critical reporting on the government.
It's a chilling image, and it really brings the potential human cost of these alleged actions into focus.
It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract political debates.
Yeah.
Right. These have real-world consequences for real people.
Exactly. The suppression of freedom of speech, the erosion of democratic norms, they have a profound impact on individuals' lives and on the fabric of society as a whole.
And it's not just about individual cases either. This podcast paints a picture of a society that's becoming increasingly polarized with these deep divisions fueled by the government. And certain members of the STF, they argue that this polarization is making it even harder to address the country's challenges.
And polarization can be incredibly destructive when people retreat into their ideological camps and just demonize those who hold different views. It becomes almost impossible to find common ground, to work together towards solutions.
And this podcast argues that the government, instead of trying to bridge those divides, is actually exploiting them for political gain. They claim that certain government policies and actions are deliberately designed to stoke division and consolidate power.
That's a concerning accusation. If true, it suggests a deliberate strategy to undermine democratic norms and erode the checks and balances that are essential for a healthy society.
So we have this multi-layered crisis unfolding in Brazil: economic instability, political controversy, potential external pressures, and allegations of government overreach and suppression of freedom. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And it raises some fundamental questions about the direction Brazil is heading in and the potential consequences of these developments.
I think it's helpful to take a step back here and try to synthesize what we've learned so far. So to recap, we've explored Brazil's significant economic challenges, starting with that massive 8 trillion real debt, which is crippling the government's ability to invest in essential services and improve the lives of its citizens.
Right, and we've seen how this economic pressure is manifesting in the daily lives of Brazilians. Rising prices, increased taxes, this pervasive sense of financial insecurity. And then there's that political layer on top of it, the controversial appointment of a socialist judge to the STF, the allegations of government overreach and censorship, and this deep political polarization that's gripping the country.
And we can't forget about the international dimension either. Lula's controversial stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict and the potential impact of U.S. politics, particularly the possibility of Donald Trump returning to the presidency. It's like Brazil is standing at a crossroads, facing all these internal and external pressures. That could have really profound consequences for its future.
Exactly. The choices that Brazil makes now will determine its trajectory for years to come, and those choices will be shaped by this complex interplay of economic factors, political maneuvering, social dynamics, and international relations.
Yeah, it's a story that's still being written, and we're only beginning to understand the full scope of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
So let's continue our deep dive. We need to examine these issues in more detail, explore the potential consequences, and consider the possible paths forward for Brazil. #TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2024-1130, part 3 of 3.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from Brazil's economic woes to the political controversies, and even how all of this plays out on the global stage. But the question I keep coming back to is, where does this all lead? I mean, what are the potential consequences if these trends we've been talking about just continue?
The question, isn't it? And while predicting the future is always tricky, we can look at some historical patterns, analyze current trends to get a sense of what the potential outcomes might be. And I think one possibility, and it's a worrying one, is that the economic situation could deteriorate even further.
Yeah.
If the government can't get a handle on the debt and inflation, it could really spiral into a full-blown financial crisis.
It's a scary thought. What would that look like for everyday Brazilians?
We're talking widespread poverty, unemployment, businesses, shutting down, a collapse in essential services like healthcare and education, essentially a significant decline in the standard of living for a huge portion of the population.
And we've seen throughout history, right, that economic hardship often leads to social unrest, political instability. Could that be where Brazil's headed?
It's definitely a risk when people are struggling to survive. They're much more likely to, take to the streets, demand change. And if the government responds with repression or they fail to address the root causes of that discontent, it can create a very dangerous cycle of instability.
Especially when you consider that there's already this climate of fear and distrust, right, fueled by those allegations of government overreach, censorship, and the erosion of democratic norms.
Yeah.
So like all these pieces we've been discussing, the economy, the politics, the social unrest, they all start to feed off each other.
Exactly. It becomes a vicious cycle that's really difficult to break out of. And that's why these allegations of government overreach and, the suppression of freedom are so concerning. Instead of addressing those underlying problems, it seems like they're trying to silence the people who are speaking out about them.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, right? It's not going to end well.
It rarely does. This kind of approach usually backfires. It leads to more resentment, more radicalization, and ultimately more instability. It's a dangerous game to play, especially in a country with Brazil's history of political turmoil.
So we've painted a pretty bleak picture here. Is there any reason for optimism? Are there any potential paths forward that could lead to a more positive outcome for Brazil?
There's always hope. Brazil's a resilient nation. They have a vibrant culture and a history of overcoming adversity, but turning things around is going to require some really bold leadership, smart policies, and a genuine commitment to democratic values.
What would that look like in practice? Where should Brazil focus its efforts if they want to get back on track?
Well, it has to start with addressing the economic crisis. The government needs to implement sound fiscal policies, control spending, attract investment. But it can't just be about austerity. They also need to invest in programs that create jobs, stimulate growth, and provide a safety net for the most vulnerable in their society.
But economic reforms aren't enough. You also need political stability and a commitment to democratic principles?
Absolutely. Brazil needs leaders who prioritize transparency, accountability, the rule of law. They need to rebuild trust with the people, listen to their concerns, and engage in genuine dialogue, even with those who hold opposing views.
And it's crucial to protect freedom of the press, right? Allow for open debate and dissent. A society where those critical voices are silenced is a society in danger of losing its way.
That's such a crucial point. A free and independent media is essential for holding power accountable and ensuring that the government is serving the interests of the people. Without it, corruption and the abuse of power can flourish unchecked.
So it's a multifaceted challenge. Brazil needs to tackle its economic woes, strengthen its democratic institutions, protect fundamental freedoms, and find a way to bridge those deep political divides that are tearing the country apart.
It's a tall order, no doubt about it, but I believe Brazil has the potential to overcome these challenges. It's a nation with immense human and natural resources, and its people have a deep love for their country and a strong desire for a better future.
It's been a fascinating a somewhat sobering deep dive into the state of Brazil. We've explored the complexities of its economic and political landscape, those concerning allegations of government overreach and the potential consequences of these trends. But we've also highlighted the potential for a more positive outcome, a Brazil where economic prosperity goes hand in hand with democratic values, social justice, and a respect for human rights. This deep dive has only scratched the surface. It's an ongoing story, and the choices that Brazil makes in the coming months and years will determine its destiny. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues, seek out diverse perspectives, and form your own informed opinions. The future of Brazil, like the future of all nations, is ultimately shaped by the actions of its people.